Yellow mixtures are always going to give you a bright, beautiful color. The problem is when we start mixing purples. Ultramarine blue is just such a heavy blue with this dark cherry red, and it makes a beautiful purple if what you're looking for is more of a muted, muddy purple. Okay, yikes. Let's try that again. Ultramarine blue, I have an apology video to make for you. I will start by saying I wasn't completely wrong. Cad red and ultramarine blue do mix together to make more muddy purples, and if you're looking for brighter mixes, to avoid that combination. But then I got this comment. It sounds like ultramarine blue is being blamed for muddy purples. I'm sorry, but this is just not true. Ultramarine blue contains red and leans toward purple, and it will make a brilliant purple so long as it is mixed with cool reds. And I realized this comment was right. It really wasn't ultramarine blue's fault or cad red's fault. They just combined together to make a muddy purple. And I challenged myself to use ultramarine blue more because I know so many watercolor artists love this color, and I wanted to be a more well-rounded artist and not blame colors for my color mixing problems. You might have seen that I have been painting a lot of tiny paintings this year in 2025. We have the goal of painting 100 tiny paintings, which equals about 8 to 9 per month. And I have been using this small split primary palette, and that's the ultramarine blue in the corner, and you can see it's actually been very well loved, and I have been using it a lot. I, again, challenged myself to use it, and I have found myself absolutely falling in love with not only the idea of having a split primary palette where you can use cool colors and warm colors and create bright mixtures alone, but also muddy mixtures when they're together, because that's what's also found in nature, but also just really falling in love with ultramarine blue. So I'm going to show you 4 different really simple projects where I use ultramarine blue to really bring these items to life. So this first one is rocks. On my Patreon channel, we have been exploring different ways to paint rocks, and this is just one of many different ways. But I love painting a base brown color, lifting some of the highlights out with a damp brush, and then mixing ultramarine blue into my original brown mixture that I had already made up for the rocks, and then adding that to the bottom of the rocks for a really cool blue shadow. Now, this ultramarine blue is not part of my limited palette because it is something I'm exploring more recently, but I am actually in collaboration with a couple of different small businesses to create a split primary ceramic palette and also create some tube paints that are in these split primary colors that I can use all the time. Anyway, all of that to say, this is my Daler Rowny pan that I had to dig from the depths because I really don't have a lot of ultramarine blue, and that needs to be corrected. And it's really fun to move these colors around and lift out some of these highlights and really see these rocks come to life. And I feel like one of the beautiful parts about ultramarine blue is it is a granulating color. And that means that when it is applied to the paper and it starts to dry, the pigments start to separate from the water and they start to show more. So it creates this really beautiful texture. And I actually really like the way that looks in shadows. It looks very realistic to shadows, and how when you take a picture in really dim light, the picture's kind of grainy. That's how some of this granulating ultramarine blue shadow looks to me. So we're going to let those rocks dry and add another layer of value and contrast into the shadows. But for now, we're going to move on to the second project, which is a group of flowers that are casting a shadow onto a wall. I started by dabbing some clean water onto the paper first so that when I added the magenta, it would give a really nice light blooming effect, which kind of creates these natural flower shapes. And then I left a little bit of white space so that I could add the green around and in. This sap green is so potent and powerful that it really overtook some of the pink. And because they're complementary colors, they can make muddy combinations. So I needed to rinse my brush, dab on a paper towel, lift some of that out, and then try to bring some of that bright pink back in. But overall, I like how they mix together together because it didn't combine too much because I wasn't mixing them with my brush as much as they were just kind of combining on the paper. But I did add some ultramarine blue into my magenta to get a darker, more beautiful purpley shadow and contrast in the flowers. So again, that commenter was correct. When I add magenta, which is a cool pinkish red, to ultramarine blue, beautiful, beautiful purples. And it was really exciting to me. Now I'm kind of making a shadow on a wall. So I'm imagining that these flowers are on like a balcony or like a window, maybe in Europe somewhere. And so these flowers are kind of casting a purpley blue shadow along the wall. And so what I have found with ultramarine blue is that when I do casted shadows, if I combine it with colors that are in the painting, so some of the purples and maybe a little bit of the greens in this painting, and I use that as the shadow color, it looks really realistic. So I love that it's not super blue, it's a little bit more purple and gives us the feeling that it's a purpley shadow because these are kind of pinky purpley flowers that are casting the shadow. And then here I'm just adding some of the little bars that might be by a window that kind of hold the flowers in. And I think the reason why I have fallen in love with ultramarine blue instead of just using the cerulean or the indigo that I have on my palette is the ultramarine blue. It feels like I'm able to get the darker values without going too deep or almost black of a color that the indigo takes me to, but also keeping it deeper and darker, whereas the cyan keeps all of my purples very bright. And sometimes you just need that deeper, muddier contrast. And I say muddier very lightly because it's only because the tone is just a couple of steps below where the cerulean's already taking it. It's not really muddy, it's just a deeper value of purple than the cerulean can give us. And you saw I mixed the cerulean in with yellow, magenta, some green to get a very dark value of shadow for the rocks. So now we have this really cool layer where we have our lightest highlighted values, we have some medium values as the rock is kind of curving around, and then we have our darkest, deepest shadow colors. And I feel like a lot of that is achievable because of the ultramarine blue. And then I'm just kind of fiddling around with the flowers, adding more details, especially like a deeper, darker purple and some shadows within the sap green. And again, I'm trying to be very heavy on the ultramarine blue to really explore what it can do, and am really excited about it. And duh, duh, I mean, it's a great color. I have just really been focused on the cyan magenta yellow color theory, which is cerulean, queen magenta, and cad yellow for me. And I've been really stubborn about sticking to it, but I'm excited about what this new chapter with ultramarine and more of a split primary palette is going to bring to me. Now I'm going to paint a chicken. I thought it would be good to paint an animal and show you how I incorporate ultramarine blue in two different ways. Now, chickens are hard mostly because of the proportions, trying to get the proportions right so it looks like a chicken. But I have mixed up this reddish brown with my limited palette. And now once I've got the kind of overall shape, I mix some ultramarine blue with the reds and the oranges and the purples on my palette. And I'm able to get this really dark, beautiful detail. And then I rinsed it off, tapped it lightly on my paper towel, and with a very light version of it, I'm finishing off the shape and the body of the chicken. And I love how it is blending with this reddish brown color that I have going on, and it's creating some natural muddy purples, which would be a more accurate color on a chicken because it's not going to have the bright feathers like an exotic bird. It's going to have muddy purples and muddy reds, and so mixing those all together to create shadows and details with the ultramarine blue is a really fun experiment in playing around with the different ways that chickens can look, because there's so many different ways you can paint a chicken even, and it doesn't even have to be true to life. It can be more creative or abstract. So I have loved playing around with ultramarine blue inside the chicken because it wouldn't have cerulean, and the indigo is just not bright enough to mix with the reds to kind of create that muddy purple. So it has been just such a great complement to the colors of animals and the shadows of animals. So after I add the details of kind of the facial features with the beak and the comb and the little wattle, the red parts of the chicken, I can use some of the ultramarine blue for details under the feathers, especially once it starts to dry. A nice ultramarine blue detail looks like such a distinct shadow. But also I can paint the shadow of the chicken on the ground. So one of my favorite ways to use ultramarine blue is mixed in with other colors because again it gives that granulating texture and lets the colors blend and look very interesting within the shadow. So before the feet had even dried, I started applying this ultramarine blue shadow and it kind of blended with the yellow on the feet and just gave the most beautiful, interesting kind of bleed when it started to dry. So I like how it can give you a nice light shadow instead of going in way too dark with Payne's Gray or even indigo. And then the final project is a little mountain. Now, this is a trust the process moment. It's not going to look like a mountain until I paint the sky, and then it's going to be bam once I add the ultramarine blue shadow. Now, this is a snowy mountain, and one of my favorite new ways to use ultramarine blue is in snow shadows. So I've painted these brown kind of rocky random shapes, and then what makes the mountain kind of appear is when I use cerulean to paint around the snow and the mountain to give it an actual shape and create the sky above it. And this is a form of negative painting where we are painting snow, but we're really painting around the snow so that it appears. So we painted around the snow to create those rocky shapes, and we painted around the snow to paint the sky. Now we're going to make sure it's so dry before we add the shadow, but this is ultramarine blue mixed in lightly with some of the colors on my palette. It's still very obviously blue, and we are just going to paint very carefully, very slowly, a glaze over this right side of the mountain in kind of an organic, jagged line so that it gives the impression that this is where the sunlight is hitting from the left and then there is shadow on the right. And you want to do it light enough that you are not disturbing the colors underneath and just leaving this nice shadow where we can still see the stone shapes coming through. So this is my apology video to ultramarine blue. I was wrong. You're amazing. Pretty much all colors are amazing. You can't blame the colors on your inability to mix them to get what you want. That's what I've learned. Any color works if you know how to use it the right way, and I'm excited to continue to explore using ultramarine in my paintings in the future, and I hope this helped you with your painting and color mixing as well.